One of the things that I'm going to talk about is the nature of thesis at SCI-Arc. It's completely different in my experience from thesis that I've seen in other places. In fact, how thesis used to be here a few years ago. And in particular, graduate thesis, I think, is a different animal even than the undergraduate thesis. One thing that's most important about it is in a strange way a co-production as much as it is individual work. It's not only a co-production of all of you students, but also of all of us, our colleagues, me and my colleagues that are involved in it. And I think any discussion of thesis would necessarily involve a conversation, I think, amongst those parties. So it's good to know exactly who thinks that this is a conversation worth engaging in and who doesn't. How's that? Because I'm not sure I have that much to say that is so insightful. What I am hoping to do is to touch on a few things that would be maybe, I think, important for us to think through and to consider, and especially to examine the moment that we're at right now. What it means to examine moments that you're at in general and what that one is that we're at. So this is probably the least images I've ever shown in a talk. That is to say, there's going to be 3. I have a lot of slides. They're all text. I've tried to arrange it a little bit karaoke style with highlighting passages of text, so I'll read some of them out loud. But I realized that there's some of the things I was talking about, that there's a handful of texts that certainly have been seminal in terms of my own thinking. I think 2 or 3 of them are considered just generally seminal in terms of questions of creative production and moments and individual talent, et cetera. I'm sure my colleagues will know at least most of the texts that we'll be going through, but I really want to put it into the context of where we are. So, thesis and SCI-Arc. When I'm mentioning that it's an unusual animal, I'm going to paint a picture of thesis at SCI-Arc maybe 6 years ago or so, and I'm going to paint a slight caricature of it. Forgive me for that, for my colleagues that were fighting mightily in the trenches during those days, but I think it's not entirely untrue. I think what we saw was a kind of late style at that time. It was about the kind of near total hegemonic victory of a certain type of digital production, and it probably had its own kind of hierarchy of projects that would have been considered at the top of the heap in those days, let's say Hernan and his students, and then descending down from there, all of my other fine colleagues, together with always a few sanctioned outliers, Wes, Coy, etc. But there was, it was a little bit of a strange situation. I think any outsider noted it. I was a kind of, I taught at SCI-Arc for years, but I was kind of an outsider coming back. It was very evident to me. Trying to imagine what was happening there. I mean, one of the features I think that you saw is you saw. I think it was mostly about talent, about displaying the talent you had in a kind of known style, very often imitative of the advisor's style of architecture or of a fairly small group. And the other thing that I noted often, virtually always, was that the work was being presented with absolutely no justification of what the work was. In other words, what was the problem that was being taken up, what was being worked on, and what conclusions could be drawn of it. That there was sometimes some rhetoric, and some of it was a kind of fancy rhetoric tied around the projects, but it was really about, I'm going to do one of these or I'm going to do one of those. This is a caricature, but I think it's not like all caricatures, it's, I think, recognizable if mapped against the reality of where things were. So what I'm curious to see, and this should be super important for all of you, is what happened over the last few years. It's a very unusual thing. I think there's a lot of factors going into it. One of them that I just started realizing was, I think the recession had a lot to do with what happened? Certainly my own story, I came to Los Angeles only partly to teach at SCI-Arc. My interest was joining a colleague of mine with a number of development projects in Koreatown, and frankly, spending less time teaching than I had been in the previous years when I was running a program at the City College of New York. We know what happened to developer projects in Koreatown and elsewhere. I certainly found myself with a lot more time on my hands and a lot of energy, and I think probably it's true that a lot of my colleagues did as well. I would even wager that it's probably the reason a lot of you are here. In other words, the time you were making decisions about graduate schools and coming into it, at about the time that you could be thinking, you know what, let's do plan B for a while and wait until the business community and the economy picks up again. So here we were. I think that's not a minor fact of it. I think there were other things. Jeff Kipnis's, I think, might have my facts wrong. He started about the same time. Brought in a lot of, I think, an incredible, not only energy, an incredible sense of relevant questions and possibilities of the moment, but also the kind of, let's say, the intellectual demands that one needed to understand a territory and plant one's flag in it. So this is a huge thing. I think there was a timing. In other words, here we had a group of all of students, of course, but a group of faculty that are very accomplished, very talented, and very ambitious. Suddenly in a period where I think there was, if not explicit, at least an implicit sense of dissatisfaction. So there was a certain timing that it was a sense that it was a time to do something else within the profession. No doubt, I like to think that my starting here at this school had some effect on it. Certainly for those of you that know me, you would know that some of my interests and those of Jeff's, that there's a fairly large area of overlap between the two. And I think under fueling all of this is that sort of, we all know how uncomfortable we feel when we're in a review and suddenly Eric Moss decides to show up. And so there is, I think, a perpetual sense that you should be dissatisfied and going somewhere else, which is Eric's great gift to the school, one of his many gifts to the school. So what we saw at this time then was an ability to sit and think through where the profession was and what would happen if one started to find areas that were, what has not been on the table, what has not been explored, what do we do in this era that, I sometimes use the term post-digital, but let's say after the euphoria of a kind of bright digital future. It turns out, I think, there were quite a few things to do, quite a few things indeed, and this is what we really see as the story of Thesis over the last 4 or 5 years, an incredible expansion of the range of topics and the relevancy of those topics and the surprising novel effects of those. I made a short list here. You could read through them. I hope you recognize at least some of them. Some of them probably account for a whole range of separate subtopics: extrusions, buildings that move, narrative, et cetera, et cetera. Cuteness in cartoons, figure, near figure and figuration, imagery and legibility, et cetera. Boolean operations, symmetries and doublings, multiple ontologies, piles, and something I can only think of as obsessive-compulsive aggregations. All right? This is, and I'm sure my colleagues are sitting here in the front row thinking of a dozen other features that I forgot to enumerate here. But this is important to understand that it's important to understand the importance of this, I guess. I don't know how else to explain it. In other words, that this is not just, boy, suddenly we started doing a bunch of new things at SCI-Arc. These are new, capital N. It was at the time when it was needed to be done and at a time when no one else was doing it outside of here. So when I'm discussing Thesis as a special thing, you can't go to other programs and just say that about them. You couldn't do that here. So so now I want to think about a little bit what it means to be an individual and what it means to be at a moment in a history of things. These are not novel observations. This is something that those that are involved in the creative life have talked about and thought about. But I think there's a couple of interesting things to look at this. The first one, and we talk about it here all of the time, when you're asked to find work that has a relevance to what you're doing, find existing work in the near history or or ancient history that has to do with what you're doing. This is not just so you sound smarter, right? Or so you sound sort of more sophisticated. It is because it is something that we actually are one discovers that there is a big project and many smaller projects that go on and have gone on, and we're joining those. So here is the first reading this is from the book of Eliot, a terrific essay which I recommend. It isn't so long, in fact, it's just a few pages long. T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent. This is from 1919. And he says, and I quote, "No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to dead poets and artists. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order amongst themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new, work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art towards the whole are readjusted." So this is, I quote these because I think this is sums up perfectly what we discuss, I think, when we tell you to look at this work. It is, there is a body, and by adding to it, one actually alters it. So this is, whoever has approved this idea of order will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. Right? So that also happens. He goes on to discuss how much you need to know about the tradition of your field in order to work in it. And he says you don't have to be a scholar with exhaustive knowledge, but you have to know a bunch of stuff, right? And you have to figure out where that is, right? That Shakespeare can read a Roman history and learn more about the history of the world than a couple of scholars could spending a lifetime in the British Museum, right? So it just depends. It depends on how you understand things. But at some point that you have to leave behind a kind of youthful enamoration with 2 or 3 works of art or 2 or 3 works of architects and forgetting everything else. At a certain point, you have to grow up and swallow all of it. You don't have to be interested in all of it. You don't have to work on all of it, but you just have to deal with it. And by the way, he says that's at around 25 years old. Okay, so that's good to know, right? No more, you can't dawdle anymore. So the other question then becomes, what is this, what are these traditions? What kind of forms do they take? George Kubler, an art and architecture historian who was for many years at Yale University, died about 20 years ago, student and translator of Henry Fauchelon, the French theoretician on art, wrote an amazing book called The Shape of Time, Remarks on the History of Things. It is a short book. So the first one's a short essay. This is a short book. But he outlines basically a kind of theory of the study of form in art. And the main thing is that he, as the quote here where he talks about, discredits the idea of studying the biography of artists in order to understand the work, and he compares it to wanting to understand a railway system by studying individual cars that move along it, right? And so what this railway network is, he writes about at some length and describes that there's I suppose that form has certain paths as it exists and as it advances through time, and that these form any number of different strands, the study of Greek vases, the study of automotive design, whatever that might be, that there is a kind of logic, and then one can study where these flows move forward, where they diverge, where they die out, where dead ones are picked up again at a future moment and revived for a new purpose, etc. So you really get a sense that there is this kind of inner logic, a complex stranded inner logic of the life of forms. If one thinks about that, then what becomes important is for each of us to ask not only who am I, but when am I? So here's Kubler. To the usual coordinates fixing the individual's position, his temperament and his training, there is also the moment of his entrance, this being the moment in the tradition, early, middle, or late, with which his biological opportunity coincides. Does that make sense? In other words, the biology is your luck, the stream is at a particular spot, and you enter it then, right? It doesn't matter, right? If your life's passion is to invent the incandescent light bulb, right? Someone would have to explain to you, that is a completely impossible task to take up with any kind of relevance. It's already been taken care of, right? So to understand that moment is important. And then here, without a good entrance, he is in danger of wasting his time as a copyist, regardless of temperament and training. In other words, it doesn't matter how good you are at science and how much you want to invent that light bulb, right? You're just being a copyist if you're not actually understanding the moment that you're in. From this point of view, we can see the, quote, universal genius of the Renaissance more simply as a qualified individual bestriding many new tracks of development at a fortunate moment in that great renovation of Western civilization, and traveling his distance in several systems without the burdens of rigorous proof or extensive demonstration required in later periods, right? It was brand new. They were just making the shit up. And it was a perfect moment to do it, and there was an expansion of it, and they didn't have to worry so much about justifying what they were doing, right? We'll come back to this point, okay? So let's see. So that's the idea of the individual entrance. But now to go back for a moment of this previous period that I was categorizing at SCI-Arc, let's say 5-6 years ago, which was mostly about the display of talent. So talent is an interesting quality. Let's just look at that for a minute. So here a little later in Kubler, where he writes about talent and genius. By this view, the great differences between artists are not so much those of talent as of entrance and position and sequence, right? So you have to, right? So, and he goes on to say, in fact, it is meaningless to debate whether Leonardo was more talented than Raphael. Both were talented. Bernardino Luini and Giulio Romano were also talented, but the followers had bad luck. They came late when the feast was over through no fault of their own. So this is fascinating, right? So you have to make sure you know what feast is on the table and which ones have already been eaten and you're just getting the table scraps of, right? This is important I think this is maybe the most critical thing for us to think about right now. So the talent, this is exactly the role of talent. This is a fantastic book, The Artist's Reality, Philosophies of Art. Mark Rothko, the painter, I'm sure a lot of you know. put together in 2004. The book was written in the early 40s, apparently, but only as a series of extended notes. His son put it together many decades later, and it's a series of extended fragments is what it is, but it's fantastic. But Rothko speaks a lot about this question of talent and what that means, as I think a lot of artists do. For skill in itself is but a sleight of hand. In a work of art, one does not measure its extent, but counts himself happiest when he is unaware of its existence in the completion of the result. Does that make sense? When you look at a work, the point is not to measure how much talent is being displayed here, right? All you want, in fact, if it's done right, one isn't even aware of it. Neither Giotto nor Goya exhibited half the skill of Correggio or Sargent, either in complexity of their undertakings or the apparent virtuosity of execution. The artist must have the particular skill to achieve his particular ends. If he has more, we are fortunate not to know it, for the exhibition of this excess would only mar his art. So that's it. One has then a certain tradition that one examines. One understands it as a living thing, with each new work altering the outline of it, let's say, of this monumental pile, according to Eliot, or picking up or killing off different strands, if this is Kubler. And then what you are, and this is, Eliot goes on to say it about how important it is for art not to be personal, right? What you have to understand is it is not about you displaying your talents, but rather that is the weapons at your disposal when you look at this complex problem of thinking, where are we and where do we go? And you use those for that. That's really the purpose of talent. The world in SCI-Arc. Well, let's see. I'm not going for the small topics here. I was saying that graduate thesis is not like thesis in other schools. This is why. This goes back to the age bracket that T.S. Eliot was talking about. It is, I think, accurate to think of your thesis project not so much as your final student project, but rather as your first project in the discipline. I think that's really what the difference is. And I think that's, which isn't to say, of course, that one finds instances of that amongst the undergraduate, and frankly, instances where projects don't live up to that amongst the graduate students. But I think there is a proper expectation, given simply not only where we are and where the school is, but your age, that this is the time now when you do this. So we are making, and I think that list that I was giving you of all of those various projects, these are making tangible contributions to the field of architecture. They're of a specific kind. They're very, very raw, and I think the discipline has barely noticed that these things have even happened. So I think it is possible to understand that when we do this, thesis is, in a sense, this is our contribution to the field of architecture. Right? And a thesis weekend, in a certain way, is a kind of discussion or symposium, a professional symposium. Right? That's really what it is. So I think if you think of it that way, then your projects, when I say this about it being the first project, I don't mean that as a kind of burden or an onus on you, or at least not the wrong kind of burden and onus. It is a burden and onus, as T.S. Eliot points out. It's not about whether your thesis is successful or not. It really depends only on the maturity of its thought and execution, right? It's actually, you study. It's very interesting to see a really intelligently formulated and undertaken thesis which fails, right? That's actual knowledge, right? This is something that Jeff talks about, and I think it's important that we think of it that way. So I don't mean it as a burden, but it is really a time to understand that that's the case. I think it's time to go a little further into that now and think about the relation to the world that we've had and the relation to the world that we should have in the future. It's possible, I think, to say on the part of many of the students, and I would say even on the part of myself and many of my colleagues, to underestimate or to dismiss the projective, even political dimension of the accomplishments of graduate thesis over the last few years on the profession. It is actually, and it ought to be, transformative and disturbing to that profession. I think it's now time to actually take control of that possibility and to find a more exact and pointed way of seeing how these projects interact with the world. A lot of what I'm talking about this afternoon comes also from Jeff's discussion at the beginning of the semester. I think his insights were right. I think some of his conclusions were right. I think in detail, I would call it somewhat naive, and it's someone trying to discuss the reality of the building project from someone who, by his own admission, knows very little about it. I don't have necessarily a clear answer of what that new engagement is, but I thought I thought maybe we should open up that discussion, and this would be an important thing to discuss. So, when we look at that list that I showed you before of all of these new topics and expansion of topics that have happened, I'm pretty certain that what we don't want to do is add to that list. In a sense, that was yesterday's problem. Doing that is like working on the light bulb. I'm not sure there is any more relevant new things to try, but all of these wild things that have been experimented with, they're lying there raw, absolutely raw, just waiting for someone to take them up and take them further, right? I don't think we can. I was talking with my thesis students. I'm going to mention a project by name, which I thought was a lovely project. Let's say Laura Kwok's project with the feathers on the buildings, right? The idea of agglomerating with an OCD-like focus a bunch of things and sticking them all together has been gone through many times already at SCI-Arc, and it has its kind of feminine version, its masculine version, its scary version, its funny toy version, right? Doing yet another one of those is like trying to reinvent the light bulb. Trying to figure out what's the next thing to do with that topic, I think that's where we are, right? So I have a few points I'm going to say. What do we do now? Carefully review the range of topics that have been developed over the last 4 to 5 years and select one. Don't make a project that replays the moment when that topic entered, right? So if we're talking like Kubler about entrances, these projects have all had their entrance. Don't try to enter them again. It just doesn't work. That's when you go, no matter through your diligence and no matter through your belief in it, when you become simply a copyist. Don't add to that range. Consider what is the next step in the maturation of that topic. This is where, I don't know. But I do think there is something, and I've been talking to people about this, which is calibrate the realness of your project. Now, what do I mean by that? Jeff talks about duration, right? And I think he mentioned when he was doing a little talk for some people through the gallery, the marching buildings of the large ones in the gallery, that those are gallery duration. That as a building, they simply wouldn't work because all of those qualities that one wants to extract from the project can be extracted from it during a visit to the gallery, not over the years that a building lives, right? So that means that it's a very precise architectural reality that it addresses. I think the fact that you're doing a thesis project and it gets shown over the thesis weekend, that's the reality of its duration. It takes nothing away from it, right? If it were, I assure you, a brick and mortar building, it would be wildly different than what we see on the walls. I'm fairly certain that if I was to make a list of what I would consider the best thesis projects, or even ask any of you to make such a list, almost all of those, if they were actually built, would be nightmarish. They would be truly horrific buildings, and we don't wish them to exist, right? It's not a criticism of them, right? They are correct in their reality. I just think that we need to figure out a way to move that reality forward a bit and less out of the range of artistic speculation. I think the more we work on projects as buildings, the more radical they will be, because it is the way in which we and you individually can start to actually make the discipline nervous, right? The more it's a bunch of crazy drawings on a wall with clearly no possibility of existence, the more one can dismiss it, right? Say, that's great, but that's one of those, right? I think we have to start removing that possibility, right? That is, we have to start realizing that's a weakness now, right? I don't know what that is. I'm not going to go down the path of professional practice that Jeff seemed to be suggesting, and even less so to suggest that this is a job strategy where, please figure out a way to do something and call it sustainability, or figure out a way to do something. Do that for sure. This is what a lot of our training is. We're out there working on things, but that's not really the thesis job, right? So I think it's really important that you think about how we calibrate the reality of what it is. It's a funny thing. When the Wozoku Tower was first published, maybe 12 years ago or so, it was shocking. It was truly a shocking proposal. Now, what's interesting about it is it was shocking in its reality. That is to say, it was built, and that's what made it radical. You all know these things, right? Clever Photoshop. Far wilder cantilever, not radical at all, right? In the Photoshop world, doing a bigger cantilever is not in any way a kind of advancement of the problem. This is easy to do in Thesis, right? You could make it as long as cantilever you want, right? It will not, the Photoshop file will not fall down, right? Nor will the Rhino or Maya file, it just won't fall down. So that isn't it. I don't know what it is. I was thinking of another example, and I'm going to just kind of leave with this, but the concept car, or as they say in Detroit, concept car. This is like a 1950s Ford version of these things. You all know these things, right? I hesitate to show these because I think there's still enough of a too much of an industrial design sensibility in a lot of SCI-Arc projects. So but nonetheless, I thought, well, this is interesting. They're great to look at, and if Ford put that into production, it would be a nightmare. Could you imagine like a traffic jams of cars that looked like this and right? It is simply way too interesting. It has the duration of the auto show. That's perfect, right? So it has a clear relationship to the profession, in that case, the auto design. I'm using design. Design is relatively trivial compared to art. We don't have that gigantic edifice that one moves in T.S. Eliot's sense. But you see what I'm saying, right? You are an auto company, and you design one thing on the road, you design another thing for an auto show, and they have a relationship to one another, and this has an effect on that, right? Where exactly is the line? I'm not sure, but I think the line has to be further towards the end result than it is now. And then a few other things. So that's more or less the end of my talk, but I just wanted just a few more quotes. First off, I wanted to revisit, I really enjoyed both Todd and Marcelin's talk, and Marcelin did that fantastic job of taking this Borges list of the categories of animals, is that right? The categories of animals and finding in it these very, her own enumeration of the thesis topics. The only reason I pulled this up is I noticed something else about this. I'm going to stick by what I was saying before in terms of not expanding the topics. However, I think there's one that hasn't really found its project yet, and that is this idea of multiple ontologies. And I think this is a great example of that, right? They're not randomly different, calling them animal categories puts them together, but they're so wildly different judgments that each one seems to exist in a different list world. And somehow it's a list where each one would project off in a completely different way. So I do think there's that. Then lastly, a terrific piece, Oscar Wilde, The Decay of Lying. I greatly recommend that you read this. It's another short piece. And karaoke style, I highlighted a few pieces here, just as a kind of, I don't know. Art never expresses anything but itself. It has an independent life, just as thought has, and develops purely on its own lines. Sometimes it returns upon footsteps and revives some antique form, as happened in the archaistic movement of late Greek art and in the pre-Raphaelite movement of our own day. At other times, it entirely anticipates its age and produces in 1 century work that it takes another century to understand, to appreciate, and to enjoy. So I guess a little bit talking about these movements. This is great. The third doctrine is that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. This results not merely from life's imitative instinct, but from the fact that the self-conscious aim of life is to find expression, and that art offers it certain beautiful forms through which it may realize that energy. It is a theory that has never been put forward before, but is extremely fruitful and throws an entirely new light upon the history of art. It's good, right? Life imitates art. It follows, as a corollary from this, that external nature also imitates art. The only effects that she can show us are the effects that we have already seen through poetry or in painting. This is the secret of nature's charm, as well as the explanation of nature's weakness. And then finally, the final revelation is that lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. Thank you.